She stood at the edge of my pool, phone pressed tight to her ear, telling the dispatcher I was trespassing on community property. I could hear her voice echo off the water, sharp, certain, almost excited. She pointed at me like I was a criminal, like this place didn't belong to me at all. I remember the smell of chlorine in the heat, the sound of cicadas buzzing, the way my hands stayed calm while hers shook just enough to give her away. "Ma'am," she said loudly, so everyone could hear, "he's refusing to leave. I feel threatened." What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this call was the worst mistake she could have made. Because weeks earlier, when the HOA started circling my property, I'd already begun preparing, quietly, carefully, legally. I'm not the kind of person who explodes. I document, I verify, I wait. And as the siren started creeping closer, I looked down at my phone in the folder she never imagined existed. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that thought rules mattered more than rights, stay with me. Because what happened next didn't just end her power, it ended the HOA's grip on the entire neighborhood. I'm not the kind of person who looks for conflict. I bought this place because I wanted quiet stability. Something that felt solid after years of moving, planning, saving, and saying not yet to everything else. I've owned this property for a long time. I live here, I pay for it, I maintain it. Every improvement came out of my own pocket, one decision at a time. No shortcuts, no handouts, just work. The pool was part of that plan, not a resort pool, not something flashy, just clean concrete, clear water, and a small deck that catches the late afternoon sun. I built it legally, permits approved, inspections passed. Every box checked. It wasn't about showing off, it was about finally having a place where I could breathe. Early mornings were my favorite. The water still, the air cool, the sound of nothing but birds and distant traffic. It felt earned. That's why it took me a while to notice something was off. At first it was small, a pause when I walked outside, someone watching a little too closely from across the fence, a clipboard where it didn't belong. I told myself I was imagining it. Neighborhoods change, people get curious. Then the notes started, polite at first, carefully worded, always framed as concerns, always vague. Pool usage, guest visibility, community harmony. I started to feel like I was being measured, judged, tested. I wasn't loud, I wasn't breaking rules, I wasn't bothering anyone, and yet somehow everything I did seemed to be observed, logged, remembered. That's when I realized this wasn't random. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about noise. And it definitely wasn't about a pool. It was about control, about someone deciding that because they could question me, they should, about power disguised as procedure. Authority pretending to be concerned. I stayed calm, I stayed polite, but inside, something shifted. Because once you've lived long enough, you learn to recognize patterns, and this was one I'd seen before. This wasn't about a pool. It never is. I didn't buy this property on impulse. It wasn't a dream I chased, it was a decision I calculated. Years before I ever signed the papers, I was running numbers late at night, turning over risks in my head, asking myself what kind of life I wanted to build that couldn't be taken away by someone else's mood or opinion. This place wasn't cheap, it took time, it took patience. It took saying no to comfort in the short term so I could have something solid in the long run. There were moments I wondered if it was worth it. When repairs piled up, when taxes went up, when the math got tight and I had to choose practicality over everything else. But I stayed with it because I wasn't just buying land, I was buying stability. The pool came later, not as a luxury, but as a milestone. Something I promised myself I'd do once the foundation was secure. I did it the right way. I pulled permits. I paid the fee. I waited through inspections. Contractors walked the site. Measurements were taken. Everything is documented, approved, finalized. It wasn't rushed, and it wasn't cheap, but it was clean, legal, mine. By the time it was finished, the pool had become more than concrete and water. It was where my days reset, where I went when work ended and noise followed me home. Some people decompress with a screen or a drink. I did it by floating on my back, staring up at the sky, letting the day dissolve. It gave my routine shape, mornings before the world woke up, evenings when the sun hit the water just right. It became a marker of time, of effort, paying off. That's why what happened next cut deeper than people might understand. Because when someone questions a thing you earned, they're not really questioning the thing. They're questioning you. Your right to be there, your right to enjoy what you built. And when the HOA started circling my pool, I felt that shift immediately. This wasn't about compliance. It wasn't about safety. It was about someone looking at what I built and deciding it should belong to them. That's when I understood what was really at stake. Not just water and concrete, but the one place I had carved out that was supposed to be untouchable. The first time the HOA reached out, it was almost friendly. Almost. It came as an email neatly formatted, full of soft language and careful phrasing. Just a quick introduction. We like to stay connected with our residents. Nothing urgent. I read it once, then again trying to figure out what it was really asking for. I replied politely, short, respectful. I thanked them for reaching out and confirmed I'd received the message. A few days later, she showed up in person. She introduced herself with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Firm handshake. Clipboard tucked under her arm like a badge. She spoke slowly, deliberately, the way people do when they assume they're the authority in the room. She said she was just checking in. Her eyes went to the pool almost immediately. I stood there listening while she talked about community values, about consistency, about how important it was that everything felt cohesive. She never accused me of anything direct. She didn't have to. Every sentence came with a suggestion hidden inside it. She asked questions that weren't really questions. How often do you use it? Do you ever have guests? Have you reviewed the most recent guidelines? When I answered, she nodded, but I could tell she wasn't listening. She was measuring, comparing, and filing things away. At one point she smiled and said, "We just like to make sure everyone's on the same page. Some people forget they're part of a community." It sounded harmless. It wasn't. That was the first time I felt it, that slight pressure behind her words. The idea that compliance wasn't optional, that approval was something she could grant or withhold. I kept my tone calm. I told her everything had been permitted and inspected, that I was happy to follow the rules. Her smile tightened. "Well," she said, glancing back at the pool, "rules can be interpreted in different ways, especially when it comes to shared spaces." That sentence stayed with me long after she left. Because my pool wasn't shared, it never had been, and yet somehow she was already talking like it was. That was the first warning sign. Not the words themselves, but how comfortable she was saying them, like she expected me to back down. Once that first interaction settled in, I started running the outcomes in my head. Not the dramatic ones, the realistic ones. If the HOA decided to push this, they had plenty of ways to do it without ever raising their voice. Fines for violations, restrictions framed as safety concerns, endless notices that chipped away at your time, your money, your patience, access rules that could quietly turn ownership into a suggestion instead of a right. And then there was reputation. In a neighborhood like this, perception spreads faster than facts. All it takes is a few carefully worded emails, a couple of conversations held just loud enough to be overheard, and suddenly you're not the guy who follows the rules, you're the problem, the difficult one, the exception. That kind of label sticks. It affects how neighbors treat you, how boards vote, even how future buyers see the property if you ever decide to sell. I'd invested too much to pretend that didn't matter. For the HOA, the incentives were different. This wasn't about my pool, it was about setting a line and making sure everyone saw what happened when you crossed it. If they could assert authority here, it created precedent. One decision that made the next one easier. One person who folded so the rest would think twice. And for her, Karen, it was personal in a way she probably didn't even realize. Control has a way of feeding itself. The more you get, the more you feel entitled to. Enforcing rules stops being about order and starts being about identity, about proving you're necessary, that you matter. I could see it already, in the way she spoke, in how comfortable she was questioning something that wasn't hers. I felt the urge to push back immediately, to correct her, to draw a hard line right then and there. But I didn't, because reacting emotionally is exactly what people like that expect. They count on it. They know anger makes you sloppy, defensive, easy to paint as unreasonable. So I slowed everything down. I stopped explaining, I stopped justifying, and I definitely stopped assuming good faith. Instead, I started paying attention to the language they used, to what they put in writing and what they avoided putting in writing, to how often community was used to mean compliance. That was the moment I decided something important. I wasn't going to win this by arguing. I was going to win it by being patient. Because when the stakes are real, your home, your investment, your right to exist without permission, you don't react, you prepare. The watching didn't start all at once. It crept in. At first it was just a feeling, like stepping outside and sensing someone had already been there. A gate that looked the same but felt different. A chair moved slight, footprints near the pool that didn't belong to me. Then I started noticing patterns. The same HOA members walking by at the same time pausing, pretending to check their phones. Conversations that stopped when I stepped into view. Someone standing a little too long near the fence line, eyes drifting back toward the water. One afternoon, I found a handwritten note tucked into my mailbox. No signature. Just a reminder about appropriate pool usage hours and visibility concerns. No citation, no rule referenced, just an implication. That's when I realized this wasn't casual curiosity. It was monitoring. I later learned they'd been taking photos, timing how long I used the pool, noting when guests came over, logging dates, durations, and vague observations like non-residents present or activity exceeding expectations. Expectations I'd never agreed to. Karen's tone shifted around that time, less friendly, more assured. She started speaking as if certain things were already settled facts. During one interaction, she gestured toward the pool and said almost casually, "Of course, this falls under shared community interest." I remember pausing, just long enough. Shared. That word did a lot of work for her. She talked about access like it was negotiable, about oversight like it was automatic. She mentioned potential scheduling conflicts and fair use, even though no one else had ever used or paid for the pool. When I pushed back gently, she smiled and said, "These things can be interpreted." That was the moment the line was crossed. Because here's something most people don't realize, and the HOA counts on that confusion. There is a clear legal difference between private amenities and common elements. Private amenities like a pool built entirely on private deeded land, paid for by the owner, and approved through permits, do not become community property just because an HOA exists. An HOA's authority only extends to what is explicitly defined in its governing documents and recorded record. If it's not designated as a common element, they cannot claim access, regulate usage beyond basic safety, or treat it as shared infrastructure. Karen either didn't know that or hoped I didn't. And the surveillance, that wasn't enforcement, that was intimidation. They wanted me to be uncomfortable, second-guessing myself. They wanted me to feel like I was being watched, because I was doing something wrong, even when I wasn't. I didn't confront them about the photos, I didn't demand explanations. I did something quieter. I started documenting everything right back. Dates, times, faces, language. Because once surveillance begins, it stops being about rules, it becomes about power. And I was starting to see exactly how far they were willing to push it. The first violation letter arrived on a Tuesday. Printed, official-looking, HOA letterhead at the top, carefully worded language that sounded neutral until you read it twice. It cited excessive noise, though there hadn't been any music. It mentioned guest overuse, even though no one had stayed longer than an afternoon. It flagged potentially unsafe conditions, without ever explaining what those conditions were. No photos attached, no specific rule quoted, just conclusions. I read it slowly, then set it down and waited for the anger to show up. It didn't. What I felt instead was something colder, a tightening in my chest, the realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a strategy. Over the next few weeks, more notices followed. One claimed my pool lighting was disruptive, even though it shut off automatically before quiet hours. Another warned that my guests were unfamiliar faces, as if that alone was a violation. Each letter ended the same way, with a polite reminder that continued non-compliance could result in further action. The language was soft, the intent wasn't. I started noticing changes in the neighborhood around the same time. People I'd waved to for years suddenly avoided eye contact. Conversations ended when I walked by. Invitations stopped coming. A neighbor I'd once helped with a fence repair crossed the street rather than pass my driveway. No one said anything directly. They didn't have to. That's how pressure works in places like this. You don't confront, you imply, you let rumor do the work. I overheard pieces of it eventually. Half sentences, carefully framed concerns. I heard he's ignoring HOA rules. Apparently there are safety issues. They say it could affect property values. No one asked me if it was true. Slander doesn't need to be loud to be effective. It just needs to sound plausible. Karen leaned into that ambiguity. She never accused me outright, but she made sure questions were asked in the right rooms. She talked about risk management and liability exposure. She positioned herself as the reasonable one, the person just trying to protect the community from a problem that happened to have my address. I could feel the walls closing in, not physically, but socially. It's a strange thing, being surrounded by people and still feeling completely alone. knowing you've done nothing wrong, but watching the benefit of the doubt disappear anyway. Every time another letter arrived, it felt like a small erosion, not of my resolve, but of my sense of belonging. That was the lowest point. Not the threats, not the fines they hinted at, but the quiet isolation. There were nights I sat by the pool, the water perfectly still, wondering how something that had brought me peace had turned into a reason for people to pull away. I replayed every interaction in my head, searching for the moment where I'd misstepped. I couldn't find one. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about correcting behavior. It was about creating an atmosphere where resistance felt exhausting. They wanted me to be tired, embarrassed, willing to compromise just to make it stop. For a brief moment, I considered it. I thought about limiting my own access, about apologizing for things I hadn't done, about shrinking myself enough to fit whatever box they'd decided I belonged in. But sitting there alone, listening to the water move against the edge, I realized something important. If I gave in now, it wouldn't end. It would only confirm that this approach worked. So instead of retreating, I changed tactics. I stopped worrying about what people were saying. I stopped trying to correct the narrative socially, and I started preparing for the moment when facts, not feelings, would matter. Because isolation is powerful, but it's also temporary, and the people who rely on it usually forget one thing. Silence doesn't mean surrender. The first time they stepped onto my property without permission, I almost convinced myself it was an accident. Almost. I came home one afternoon and found the side gate unlatched. Nothing broken. Nothing missing. Just wrong. The kind of wrong you only notice when you know exactly how things are supposed to be. I told myself maybe someone leaned on it. Maybe the wind caught it. The next time, there were footprints. Not near the street. Not along the sidewalk. Right up by the pool deck. Fresh impressions where the concrete was still slightly damp from the morning rinse. Someone had walked around slowly. Deliberately. That's when I stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt. Over the following days, it became impossible to ignore. HOA members, always in pairs, walking the boundary line, measuring tape in hand, phones angled carefully, snapping photos when they thought I wasn't home. One of them actually rested a clipboard against my gate while writing, like the fence itself belonged to them. Once I caught Karen touching the latch. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize. She just looked at me and said, "We're allowed to inspect common areas." I told her calmly that this wasn't a common area. She smiled and said, "That's still being reviewed." That was the moment I understood how far they were willing to go. So I started documenting everything. I installed discrete cameras, not to spy but to protect myself. I logged dates and times, took photos of their measuring tapes crossing my property line, saved emails where they implied access without explicitly stating it. Every interaction went into a folder, labeled and backed up, because here's the thing, most HOAs don't want residents to fully understand. HOA authority does not override trespass law. Even HOA board members are private individuals when they step onto privately deeded land without permission, unless governing documents specifically grant access for emergencies, utilities, or scheduled maintenance. They have no right to enter, measure, photograph, or inspect private property. Doing so can expose them to civil liability, regardless of their title. Karen either assumed her position protected her, or she assumed I wouldn't challenge it. Both assumptions were wrong. The more they crossed boundaries, the more confident they became. And confidence makes people careless. They started showing up during predictable windows, leaving the same shoe prints, using the same phrases when confronted. Patterns emerged. And once you see a pattern, it stops being personal. It becomes evidence. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't tell them what I was collecting. I let them believe they were in control. Because the truth was, every step they took onto my property without permission was another line they crossed, and another line they couldn't erase. By then, the conflict had moved beyond annoyance or inconvenience. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was trespass, and they were building the case for me, one careless visit at a time. The first time Karen mentioned the police, she did it casually. We crossed paths near the fence line, and she said it like an aside, almost conversational. "You know, if this keeps escalating, we may have to involve authorities." She smiled when she said it, like she was offering advice instead of a threat. I nodded. Said nothing. After that, the word police started appearing everywhere. In email. In meeting minutes. Inside comments meant to be overheard. She talked about liability exposure and safety enforcement, always circling back to the idea that law enforcement could be called if necessary. The implication was clear. She wanted me to be nervous. second-guessing myself, afraid that one wrong move would turn me into the villain in a story she was already writing. I could feel the tension building. Every time I stepped outside, I wondered who was watching. Every time someone walked past my house, I listened for the pause, the moment where curiosity tipped into scrutiny. Still, I didn't react, because by then I understood something important. When someone threatens 911, they're not looking for resolution. They're looking for leverage. They're trying to turn authority into a weapon. So instead of arguing, I prepared. I requested copies of the HOA's governing documents. Every version, every amendment. I pulled the recorded plat maps from the county, confirmed property boundaries down to the inch, reviewed the permits for my pool, the inspection sign-offs, the final approval. Everything matched. Then I organized the evidence they'd been handing me. The violation letters with no cited rules, the emails where access was implied but never justified, the camera footage of HOA members entering my property, the timestamps that showed patterns. I labeled each file clearly, saved duplicates, backed everything up, off-site. I even started keeping a simple journal, dates and times, exact phrases used, no emotion, just facts. Because facts don't escalate situations, people do. Karen didn't know any of this. From her perspective, I looked quiet, passive, maybe even intimidated. She started acting more confident, more public, mentioning the police in front of neighbors, framing it like she was being patient with someone unreasonable. That's how people get sloppy. The threat became more explicit the week before the call. She told me directly that if I continued refusing to comply, she would have no choice but to contact law enforcement for trespass and disorderly conduct. I remember the moment clearly. I stood there listening, hands relaxed at my sides, the pool behind me still and empty, and I felt something settle inside me. Not fear. Clarity. I realized I didn't need to convince her of anything. I didn't need to correct her assumptions, and I definitely didn't need to defend myself in advance. Because if she wanted the police involved, that was fine. I was ready. That's when I stopped explaining. And I started preparing. By the time Karen felt confident enough to threaten 911, I already knew more about the HOA than most of the board members did. What started as basic due diligence turned into something else entirely. The deeper I looked, the more inconsistencies surfaced. Small at first, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. But patterns don't lie. The first thing I noticed was enforcement history. I requested prior violation records, not just mine but others in the community. What came back was incomplete, selective. Some residents were fined aggressively for minor issues. Others were ignored entirely for the same behavior. Enforcement wasn't consistent. It was targeted. Then I looked at the covenants themselves. Several of the rules Karen kept referencing had expired years earlier. They'd never been properly renewed or re-recorded. On paper, they looked authoritative. Legally, they were ghosts, still cited, still enforced, but no longer valid. That alone was enough to raise serious questions. But it didn't stop there. I compared the HOA's claimed community boundaries with the county's recorded plat maps. The lines didn't match. In more than one place, the HOA's internal diagrams extended beyond what was legally designated as common property. My pool very clearly sat well within my private parcel. And then there were the complaints. Buried in county records were prior disputes involving the same HOA, residents who'd pushed back before me, accusations of overreach, unauthorized inspections, improper fines. Most of them had settled quietly, not because the HOA was right, but because fighting back takes time and energy most people don't have. I organized everything. The expired covenants, the selective enforcement records, the boundary discrepancies, the documented trespass, all of it went into a single folder. Clean, labeled, cross-referenced. That folder wasn't anger, it wasn't revenge, it was preparation. And here's the part HOAs rarely want residents to fully understand. An HOA's authority does not come from confidence or repetition. It comes from recorded documents. If a rule is not properly adopted, renewed, and recorded according to state law, it cannot be enforced. If a boundary is not clearly designated as a common element in the plat, it remains private property. Titles, positions, and meeting votes do not create authority where the documents do not support it. Karen had been enforcing assumptions. I had documentation. That difference mattered because when law enforcement gets involved, tone and confidence stop carrying weight. What matters is what's written, what's recorded, what can be verified on the spot. I knew that if the police showed up, Karen would speak first. She always did. She'd sound certain. She'd sound reasonable. And then I'd hand over the folder. I didn't need her to know what I'd found. I didn't need her to back down. All I needed was for her to make the call she thought would end the situation. Because once she did, the story wouldn't be hers anymore. The day she made the call was quiet in the way storms usually are. The sun was high, the pool water barely moving, light bouncing off the surface in slow ripples. I just finished a lap and was standing at the edge, towel over my shoulder, when I saw her coming down the path. Karen didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She stopped just outside the gate and stared, like she was confirming something to herself. Then she pulled out her phone. I didn't realize who she was calling at first. Not until her voice shifted. "This is the Homeowners Association president," she said loudly, pacing now. "We have a resident refusing to comply with community rules. He's on property that may not belong to him, and I feel unsafe approaching him." I stayed where I was. I hadn't said a word. She kept talking, describing me like I wasn't standing 10 feet away, saying I was being confrontational, that I was ignoring repeated warnings, that she was afraid the situation could escalate. None of it was true, but she said it with confidence, with practiced concern. She glanced toward the street more than once, checking to see who was watching. People were. A few neighbors had stopped walking. Someone stood on their porch, pretending to water plants. Another lingered near a mailbox that didn't need checking. Karen's voice got higher, more urgent. "He refuses to leave," she said. "He's trespassing on what we believe is shared property. I'm worried about safety for myself and the community." I remember thinking how carefully she avoided specifics. No direct accusations, just enough suggestion to paint a picture. I could hear the dispatcher through the phone, asking questions. Karen answered them all quickly, confidently, like she'd rehearsed this moment. I took a slow breath. The sound of sirens reached us before the cars were visible, distant at first, then close, growing louder as they turned onto our street. Karen's posture changed immediately. She straightened, lowered her voice, switched into something almost fragile. "I'm just trying to do my job," she said into the phone. "I don't want anyone to get hurt." She ended the call and slipped the phone into her pocket. For the first time, she looked at me direct. "You didn't have to make this difficult," she said quietly. I didn't respond, because by then I could feel the shift. The moment when private pressure becomes public spectacle, when assumptions harden because there's an audience. Neighbors had gathered now, not close, but close enough. Curious, uncertain, watching to see how this would end. The sirens cut off abruptly. 2 patrol cars rolled to a stop at the curb. Doors opened. Footsteps approached. Karen took a step forward, ready to speak first. I stayed where I was, calm, towel still over my shoulder, the folder waiting inside. The moment she'd been preparing for had arrived. She just didn't know yet who it would favor. The sheriff didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. He stepped out of the car the way people do when they're not expecting trouble. Steady, unhurried, eyes already taking in the scene. The pool, the gate. Karen standing a little too straight. The neighbors hovering at a distance, pretending not to stare. He nodded to her first, listened while she launched into her explanation. She spoke fast. Too fast. Words tumbling over each other in practiced concern. She said community a lot. Said shared space. Said non-compliance. She mentioned safety twice. Liability 3 times. She framed herself as someone who had tried everything before making the call. I stood quietly to the side, hands visible. Voice neutral when I spoke. "I'm the property owner," I said. "I have documentation," that was all. The sheriff glanced at me, then back at Karen. He didn't interrupt her right away. He let her talk herself into a corner, let the narrative stretch until it started contradicting itself. When she finally paused, he turned to me. "What documentation do you have?" I walked to the table by the pool and picked up the folder. It felt heavier than it actually was. I handed it to him without commentary. No speeches, no emotion, just paper. He flipped through it slowly. Permits first, inspection approvals, recorded plat maps, property boundaries highlighted cleanly, camera stills with timestamps, emails printed and organized. Karen leaned in almost immediately. "That's not the full picture," she said. "Those documents don't override HOA authority." The sheriff raised a hand, not sharply, just enough. "I'll let you know if I have questions," he said. She nodded, but she didn't step back. He kept reading. The longer he looked, the quieter the space became. Conversations stopped, someone coughed, the pool pump hummed in the background, steady and indifferent. Karen tried again. "Our covenants allow oversight," she said. "We're responsible for enforcing standards." He's refusing access. The sheriff turned one page, then another. Finally he looked up. Access to what? He asked. Karen hesitated. The pool, she said. It's considered. He didn't let her finish. Is it designated as a common element? He asked. She opened her mouth. I tried again. It falls under shared community interest. That's when he sighed. Not annoyed, just resolved. He tapped the plat map with his finger. This parcel, he said, pointing, is privately deeded. The pool is fully contained within it. Karen shook her head. That's not how we interpret it. The sheriff looked at her directly for the first time. Interpretation isn't the issue, he said. Recorded documents are. He turned slightly so others could hear. Permits are valid. Inspections are complete. There's no indication this is community property. Karen's voice sharpened, but he's been non-compliant. We've issued violations. For what statute? The sheriff asked. She blinked. For HOA rules. Which rule? He said. She gestured vaguely. General use standards. He closed the folder. That sound landed harder than any raised voice could have. Then he said it, calm, clear, final. Ma'am, this is private property. You had no authority to be here. The words hung in the air. For a moment, Karen looked genuinely confused, as if the script she'd been following had suddenly changed languages. That can't be right, she said. We were acting in good faith. The sheriff shook his head. Entering private property without permission isn't good faith. It's trespass. A ripple moved through the onlookers. Someone whispered. Another neighbor shifted closer, curiosity overpowering caution now. Karen's posture collapsed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. The confidence drained out of her face, replaced by something brittle. I was trying to protect the community, she said. I understand, the sheriff replied. But your authority has limits. He handed the folder back to me. From what I can see, he continued, there's no basis for enforcement here, and there's no justification for calling this in as a police matter. He turned back to her. I'd advise you to consult legal counsel before continuing any action related to this property. The silence afterward felt different, heavier, clarifying. Karen didn't argue again. She could. The language she'd relied on, community standards, authority, had lost its power the moment documents replaced assumptions. The sheriff gave me a final nod. Call us if there's further harassment, he said. Otherwise, you're free to go about your day. And just like that, the illusion shattered. The patrol cars pulled away. Neighbors lingered, no longer sure who to side with. Conversation started again, but the tone had changed. Karen stood there alone now, clipboard hanging uselessly at her side. For the first time since this started, she had no leverage, and everyone could see it. The shift didn't happen all at once. It moved the way truth usually does, slowly at first, then all at once. Neighbors who'd been standing at a distance started inching closer, not to Karen but to each other. Conversations broke out in low voices, questions surfaced. The same people who'd avoided my driveway for weeks were suddenly curious, trying to understand what they'd just witnessed, because what they'd been told no longer matched what they'd seen. Karen tried to recover. She laughed once too sharply and said there must have been a misunderstanding. Those things had gotten blown out of proportion. She reminded everyone that the HOA's only goal was keeping the neighborhood safe and compliant. But the words landed differently now. People were replaying the moment in their heads, the sheriff pointing to the map, calm certainty in his voice. The way Karen had faltered when asked for specifics. Once authority cracks in public, it never seals cleanly again. Someone asked her gently at first why there were so many violation letters if nothing was actually wrong. Another neighbor mentioned they'd received a warning for something similar the year before, also vague, also undocumented. The pattern started emerging out loud. Karen blamed process. Said things were under review. But every answer created another question, and this time she wasn't controlling the room. By the end of the day, the story had already changed. Not because I told it, but because people compared notes. The HOA board noticed the change immediately. Emails started going out that evening, hurried and poorly phrased. Emergency meetings seluds. Language softened. Words like clarification and reassessment replaced enforcement and compliance. Panic has a rhythm. It sounds like overcommunication. Like people trying to get ahead of something they can't quite outrun. Board members who'd been silent for months suddenly wanted input. I wanted to review procedures, wanted to ensure alignment with governing documents. Too late. Once residents realize rules are being enforced selectively, trust doesn't erode, it drops. Karen stopped appearing near my property after that. No more clipboards, no more measurements. No more quiet inspections disguised as concern. She attended the next HOA meeting, but she didn't speak much, sat rigidly, took notes she didn't share. And when questions came about authority, about boundaries, about past enforcement, she deferred. Passed the microphone, looked anywhere but at the people she'd once spoken over. The board announced they'd be consulting legal counsel. That alone told everyone what they needed to know. Because you don't consult lawyers when you're confident you're right. You do it when you realize you've been exposed. I didn't celebrate. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't correct the rumors that had once worked against me. I didn't need to. The truth was already moving through the neighborhood on its own. And once people see how power actually works, how easily it can be misused, they don't forget. Karen's story hadn't just unraveled. It had lost its audience. The consequences didn't arrive with drama. They came the way real accountability usually does, through paperwork, deadlines, and language that suddenly mattered a lot more than it used to. A few weeks after the incident, the HOA circulated a formal notice. I was careful. Legal, stripped of the confident tone they'd once used so freely. It acknowledged procedural errors and overreach in enforcement practices. No names were mentioned, but the message was clear enough. The board had been warned, not informally, not hypothetically. A letter from council outlined specific violations: unauthorized entry, improper enforcement, and misrepresentation of authority. The kind of findings that don't make headlines but absolutely change behavior. Fines were assessed, not massive ones, but enough to sting. Enough to make sure the issue couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding. More importantly, the HOA was formally restricted from conducting inspections or issuing violations on private amenities without documented authority. That clause alone changed everything. Karen stopped being the face of enforcement almost immediately. At first it was subtle. Her name disappeared from email signatures. Meeting agendas listed her as absent, more often than not. When residents reached out with questions, responses came from generic addresses instead of her direct line. Then the shift became official. The board announced a restructuring. Committees dissolved. Roles reassigned. They framed it as streamlining, but no one missed the point. Karen was no longer in charge of enforcement. She didn't represent the HOA publicly. She didn't speak for the board. She'd been silenced without ceremony, not fired in a dramatic vote, not called out in a meeting, just removed from the position she'd used as leverage. The most surprising part came last. A formal notice arrived in my mailbox, delivered the old-fashioned way. Printed, signed, dated. It acknowledged that prior violation letters related to my property were issued in error. It confirmed that my pool was a private amenity outside HOA jurisdiction and that no further action would be taken. It didn't say the word apology, but it didn't need to, because when an institution corrects itself in writing, it's admitting fault in the only language that counts. Copies of the notice were sent to the community. The same neighbors who'd once looked at me with suspicion now had documentation to replace the rumor. No commentary, no spin. Just facts. After that, the pressure stopped completely. No more letters, no more warnings, no more concerns. The boundaries were clear again, and what struck me most wasn't the relief, it was the quiet. The absence of tension I'd grown used to, the feeling of walking outside without scanning the street, of sitting by the pool without wondering who might be watching. Karen still lived nearby. I saw her occasionally. She kept her distance, avoided eye contact. Whatever authority she'd once wielded had dissolved into something much smaller. I didn't take satisfaction in that, because this was never about winning against a person. It was about restoring balance. And in the end, the system did what it's supposed to do. Once it was forced to look at itself honestly, the consequences weren't loud. They were permanent. After everything settled, I found myself back in the same place where it had started. Not in the middle of an argument, not at a meeting, not proving anything to anyone, just by the pool. The water was still, catching the light the same way it always had. Nothing about it looked different. And yet, the way I felt standing there had changed completely. I thought about how close I'd come to reacting early on. How tempting it had been to push back the moment Karen first questioned me, to raise my voice, to demand respect, to try to win in the moment instead of thinking long-term. That urge is human. Immediate reactions feel powerful. They feel satisfied, but they're also fragile. What I learned through all of this is that patience isn't passive, it's active restraint. It's choosing not to give someone the reaction they're trying to provoke. It's slowing down when everything around you is trying to speed you up. Every time I stayed calm, I gave myself room to think. Every time I documented instead of arguing, I built something solid. Every time I waited, I let the truth catch up on its own. There were moments when that restraint felt like weakness, like I was letting things slide, like I was alone in the fight. But looking back now, I can see it clearly. Restraint wasn't what cost me, it's what protected me. The situation didn't resolve because I outshouted anyone or outplayed them socially. It resolved because I stayed grounded when others relied on pressure and performance. Because I trusted facts more than feelings. Because I understood that real authority doesn't need to announce itself. Quiet strength doesn't draw attention. It doesn't demand agreement. It just holds. I didn't come out of this more suspicious of people. If anything, I came out more confident in myself, more certain about where my boundaries are and how to defend them without losing who I am in the process. The pool went back to being what it was always meant to be. A place of routine, of recovery, of calm. A reminder that what you build with intention is worth protecting with patience. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it doesn't look like a confrontation or a victory lap. Sometimes it looks like standing in the same place you stood before, but feeling different, steadier, less reactive, more at peace. And that's the kind of strength no one can take from you. Because once you learn it, you don't need permission to use it. If you've ever dealt with an HOA that made you feel small, if you've ever been watched, warned, or quietly pressured for doing nothing wrong, you're not alone. Stories like this happen more often than people admit. Most of them never get told, not because they aren't real, but because the people living them are tired. Tired of arguing, tired of paperwork. Tired of feeling like standing up for themselves will only make things worse. If that's you, I want you to know something. Your experience matters. If you've been through an HOA nightmare, whether it ended quietly or you're still in the middle of it, share your story in the comments. Not to vent, but to remind others that these situations follow patterns. And patterns can be recognized, documented, and challenged. If you're here because you care about fairness, property rights, and real-world justice that doesn't rely on shouting or shortcuts, consider subscribing. This channel isn't about chaos or confrontation, it's about patience, preparation, and endings that actually hold up in the real world. I'll keep sharing stories where pressure doesn't win, where false authority gets exposed, and where quiet strength proves more powerful than intimidation. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just about a pool. It was about learning how power really works. Some people think power comes from rules. I learned it comes from knowing the truth and waiting.